So you may remember from Monday that I really emphasized this idea of evaluation, and we're going to do that again tonight because the questions that you're going to see on the AP US History exam are going to relate to either causation, comparison, or continuity and change over time. And when you're answering those questions, I want you to really think about adding sophistication to your argument. So if you've got a causation question, sometimes you're able to look at both causes and effects of whatever the topic is that they're asking. If you only have causes, which is fine in some cases, I want you to at least begin to evaluate those causes and which one is the most significant cause of the ones that you have. That's something that we're going to be looking at tonight. Same thing with comparison. If you've got similarities and differences, that's fabulous. If you only have differences, again, determine which of those is the most significant. Same thing with continuity and change over time, because this adds in the evaluation to your answer. All right, so let's review some of that content in time period 4 before we get into some question samples. We start in 1800, and the big idea here with 1800 is the election, and this is where we're going to see for the first time the transition to a different political party and the transfer of power. You may remember from yesterday's session, Mr. Pulaski really talked about Washington's farewell address, and he had warned everybody, you know, don't tie into these political parties because your focus may be more about your party than making progress for the United States. And so he was really worried about the division that might cause in the nation. Well, we know that happened anyway, especially with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans that formed. So Washington was president. He obviously didn't like political parties, but his ideology would have aligned a little bit more closely with the Federalists, as we know with Hamilton's financial plan and all of that. But then we have John Adams, the second president. And after John Adams, he has one term in office. And one of the things that really was criticized of Adams in his presidency was the Alien and Sedition Acts. And you might remember from what you studied in your class that was a policy that was meant to restrict people speaking out against the government or actions or political figures. And that was something that the Democratic Republicans really used against John Adams. And so they would much prefer state power over federal power. They were saying, you know, we're not going to follow that in our states. And that's where you saw the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that were policies passed by the states to say that they weren't going to follow that federal law, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And that's one of the big differences here between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, those two early parties in the first party system. Federal power, obviously meaning that you've got this federal government, the legislature, and the laws that they passed would have been the primary laws that people would follow. Then the Democratic Republicans believed that they really wanted to hang on to that state power. That was something that they were trying to hold on to and not turn over too much power to a federal government. And I think part of that may be kind of that old colonial fear of maybe getting too much like a monarchy. So bottom line, this becomes one of the main issues in the election of 1800 is state power versus federal power. And in that election, Thomas Jefferson, the head of the Democratic Republican Party, won the election. So we transfer from one party to the other. And that's never been done before. How is it going to happen? Was there going to be some sort of a fight or some ruckus that builds up? And it was a peaceful transfer of power that sets that tradition in the United States. So Jefferson is president, and there are a number of really key important topics that you need to be familiar with Jefferson's presidency. And again, in our AP Daily Live reviews here for your exam, we're here to really help you tie this information into how you would use it on the exam. If you want to deep dive into some of these topics, Marbury versus Madison, the Louisiana Purchase, the issues with the embargo and the French Revolution and which side the US was going to take, a lot of those more detailed discussions of those concepts would be in the AP Daily videos. And we did read on some of the Google Forms. You were saying you keep mentioning these AP Daily videos. Where are they? Where can I find them? You can find those in AP Classroom. And so those are there for you. So these are some key issues. And again, it's going to be about this idea of state versus federal power. Jefferson comes in, he's much more in tune with this agricultural approach to the economy more than the industrialized approach that the Federalists were promoting, this, kind of market economy. So that's going to be a difference here with Jefferson. So Marbury versus Madison, you'll remember, was the court case that establishes judicial review for the Supreme Court of the United States, which would have been something that the Federalists would have liked. You might remember that John Marshall was the Supreme Court Chief Justice who's going to be deciding this, and he's a Federalist. So when he's on that court for 30-something years, he's going to be making his rulings based on that Federalist ideology. So these parties are important, and the way that they interpret the Constitution is important. Do they have strict construction or do they have loose construction? And that's going to be something that you want to pay attention to as we begin to look at some of our practice questions here in a few minutes. Another one of the really, really big topics in time period 4 is this growth of industrialization. You may remember the Lowell factories that you studied in time period 4, where the Lowell factory girls, they begin to work there, and they've got the textile industry. And that textile industry, the production in the North, is being fed from the cotton production in the South. And a lot of that is tied to that invention by Eli Whitney, the cotton gin in the 18 teens. And that really makes cotton king in the South. You may have heard that phrase before. So when I've got this set up, when we talk about the market revolution, we're talking about each region of the country specializing in a certain factor of the U.S. economy. In the North, it's all about that industrialization. They've got that the geography, the swift moving rivers that are generating the power to move those factories and to spin the thread into the cloth, and then be able to distribute it, far and wide because of the rivers that are there. The South is going to be the cash crop production. Early on during the colonial period, it was going to be the tobacco and the rice production, but we begin to transition into cotton production because of all of that demand in the northern part of the United States, but also in England. So if we look at this, we've got this connection here. So there's a connection with cotton production coming out of the South. As much as they can produce, that's where they're going to be making money. Then in the North, all these finished goods, they're going to turn right around and sell those back to the people in the South and also the people living in the West. So these are those finished products that they're going to be completing. Now, these people in the West, when we're talking about West at this time, it's what today we would think of as the Midwestern part of the United States, because the boundary before the Louisiana Purchase would have been the Appalachian Mountains. But now we've got the Louisiana Purchase, but still that Midwestern area, or at that time, the West, they're going to be producing a lot of the food stuff that's going to then go back and be sold to the South and then North to feed them. So basically, all of the regions of the country are connected to one another economically. And for this to work, we've got to have really good transportation. And that's also some of the new technology that comes about in time period 4 in the 1830s and 1840s. We're going to start with the canal boom. You may remember the Erie Canal that was connecting New York City to the interior, to the Great Lakes. And then we have the railroads, and the railroads are going to really be the key to all of this. We've got an expansive railroads. They're cheaper to construct. They're easier to construct. They're faster to construct than the canals. So where people thought the canals were going to be the transportation mode of the future, it turns out it was going to be railroad. But all of this relies on transportation. So here's my question. Who's going to pay for all those railroads? If we're connecting multiple regions of the country, is it going to be a private corporation that pays for the construction of that railroad? If it's going to cross over between one state to another, should each state pay for it themselves? Who's going to pay for all of this? So there began to be different ideas about, these what we call internal improvements, how we're going to connect the transportation. And that's going to be a difference of opinion. One individual who is going to come up with a plan to try to promote all of this and protect those American businesses is Henry Clay. And if you watched any of the AP Daily videos, you know that Henry Clay is one of my favorites. And I know my students out there from Lassiter High School are watching this, and they're probably laughing because they know how much I really like Henry Clay. Anyway, Henry Clay's American system is going to have three parts. This is what he's proposing, and he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's a very, very powerful politician from Kentucky, and he's promoting another Bank of the United States, right? We had that initially with Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. It was only chartered for 20 years. He wants to bring back that second Bank of the United States. He wants to have a tariff, and that's a tax on imported goods, which is going to make them more expensive to have goods from England coming in to be sold. We want people to buy American-made products, so we're going to make the other ones more expensive coming in from the outside. And he's also saying the federal government should pay for these internal improvements, because if we can connect all of these areas, it's going to make everybody much more economically sound in all regions of the country. But hang on a minute, he's a Democratic Republican. Let's think back. One of the differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans was their view on the Bank of the United States. That's what starts the division to begin with, way back with Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. They were fighting over whether the Constitution gave the federal government the authority to create a Bank of the United States. Henry Clay's a Democratic Republican. He is in the party of Thomas Jefferson, who was absolutely opposed to this. But he's kind of changed his ideology here by the 1830s and 1840s. All right, so if we look at these, all three of these provisions of his American system are much more like the Federalist ideas, even though he's a Democratic Republican. So that leads us to looking at this political party system review. And this is something that my students really kind of get confused with, is how we have different parties, but the ideas really largely remain the same. So let's review back the first party system. When Washington says don't have political parties, but we create them anyway, we've got the Federalists and we have the Democratic Republicans. So we've already talked about that. One of the things that ends up happening that causes the Federalist Party to really collapse is the War of 1812. And you may remember that that was largely because of the interference with American shipping, with the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Wars, where France and Great Britain were kind of vying for American loyalty and support, and they were getting involved in interfering with our shipping, which we know was very important at that time. The Federalists, who were more aligned with the British, didn't want to go to war with the British because that's who's buying a lot of they're our main trade partner. So they were opposed to this war that ended up being really, really popular. So there was the Hartford Convention, and you may remember some of those topics from your class. But bottom line, after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party basically collapses. And all we have is more unity over the connection of the United States, and we call it the era of good feelings. And there's really just one political party. By 1824, there's going to be an election where 4 different Democratic Republicans are running in the same election. And it ends up dividing the party and the outcome. Well, one of those individuals who was running in that election in 1824 was the hero, or at least the what seemed to be the hero of the War of 1812, was Andrew Jackson. And he and Henry Clay and 2 others are John Quincy Adams and William Crawford are running in the election of 1824. And because there's 4 people, nobody really gains a majority in the Electoral College. So it ends up going to the House of Representatives. Well, remember Henry Clay? He's going to end up being the deciding factor, and he throws his support to John Quincy Adams, and then he becomes Secretary of State. And Jackson is furious, saying there's got to be some sort of behind-the-scenes deal that was made. And so he starts to call out Henry Clay and says, you're not a Democratic Republican. Your ideas don't align with that. So I'm going to break away, and I'm going to form a true Democratic Party that reflects the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. That's where he gets the Democratic Party, and that's the Democratic Party of today. Henry Clay eventually says, okay, fine. I'm not exactly like the old Democratic Republicans, but I'm going to form my own party, which will be the Whig Party. So we now have the second party system, Whigs and Democrats, but really the ideas have never changed. So it's the same ideas, different parties. So I hope that clears up some of that confusion. And these multiple choice questions are dealing with that rise of the conflict over slavery, right? Because we're adding territory. In tomorrow's episode, you're going to be looking at manifest destiny and that expansion west, and whether or not slavery is allowed in that expansion. So we've got the slave rebellions that are throughout the time period from the colonial period up through Nat Turner in the 1830s. So these slave rebellions are starting to grow. We've got the justification that white Southerners are using for slavery, where they're claiming that this was an essential need for them. Even some people, some of those industrialists in the North, the manufacturers were looking at slavery as feeding their profits. And then some of them claimed that religious justification and said that it was a positive good. Then we've got some of the free Black communities that form. You've got the AME Church, Frederick Douglass, absolutely one of the key abolitionists you need to know about. And then the Missouri Compromise. So again, some of these topics are much more fully explained in AP Daily and AP Classroom. All right, so let's look at an example for the multiple choice sets. So again, they're going to be in sets. These would be a passage set where you've got this letter from the South Carolina governor, James Henry Hammond, and you've got Frederick Douglass and his famous speech. This is really one of my favorite works from Frederick Douglass, The Meaning of 4th of July for a Negro from 1852. And so as you read through these, look at the questions. Which of the following groups would be most likely to support the perspective of Frederick Douglass? So it's going to be point of view. So who would support Frederick Douglass's approach here? So you've got the governor who's saying, you know, he's still a slaveholder, even though I'm a slaveholder, and he's not saying he's going to give up his slaves anytime soon. He says that it's his Christian duty to teach slaves about Christianity and God. And so these are, and treat them humanely because that's what God has entrusted them to do. So it's like justifying slavery in his mind through religion. And then Frederick Douglass is saying, you know, this is the most unchristian thing possible, that this is not something that should be done based on the Bible. So who would support Frederick Douglass's point of view, that of abolition? So I would definitely say the Northern abolitionist. It wouldn't be the Southern Democrats. They would be wanting to hold on to their slaves. Wouldn't be the Southern planters, which were the large-scale plantation owners. And it probably wouldn't be the merchants for the very reason that we just talked about, that in some cases, they're going to be the ones that are financially benefiting in some ways. Look at the second question. The language used in both excerpts most directly reflects the influence of which of the following? Well, what have we been talking about here in time period 4? And we're seeing both of them using religion as the South Carolina governor is using it as justification to keep slaves, and Frederick Douglass is saying that this is the reason not to have enslaved persons. So I would definitely say Second Great Awakening. States' rights would not be in both of those at all. Manifest destiny, that's that expansion west, and not American nationalism, definitely the religious movement. And then the last question here, the excerpt from James Henry Hammond is most clearly an example of which of the following developments in the mid-19th century: a decline of slavery in the southern states as a result of gradual emancipation. I don't see him a decline in slavery. If anything, he's saying he's going to keep slaves. Increasingly restrictive nature of slavery in the South, enforced by stronger slave codes. Expanding use of moral arguments by Northern anti-slavery activists, and then the growing tendency among Southern slaveholders to justify slavery as a positive good. So what do you think? Which of those would be the correct answer? I'm going with D. All right, so this tendency to say that it was a positive good.